There's 3 names I could have called this, so I went with all 3 titles. How can documentation become inherently agile, like a hippopotamus, which is the most agile of beasts, and awesome and vicious? How can you foster a culture that gets your developers excited about documentation? Or how can you foster a culture that gets your developers excited about making their customers happy? All of these are valid points, so why not give it 3 titles? So what we're going to get down to today is discussing just the basics of why it's important, why it doesn't work often, why it gets rejected often. Agile and documentation kind of sounds like an oxymoron. Then we're going to go through 3 stories. I'm a storyteller, or I brand myself as a storyteller. I'm more likely the translator for a lot of tech people and help them tell their own stories. So today we're going to talk about 3 different stories. We're going to talk about Waterfall to Agile transformation, a Kanban that went Agile with Rice, which is a really interesting thing we're going to talk about. How you can do Scrum and basically make Agile transformation. How do you make documented, meaning done, which is another thing that's missed often. How we get into automation, continuous documentation, and even going documentation first. And then discussing a little bit about who's in charge of documentation, or if it's Agile, would anyone be in charge if it's flat? So that's the idea, to give you a tiny bit of background. I'm mostly in the API space and the Agile space. So bringing the 2 together across software would be something really logical. All software is pretty much leveraging APIs at this point. Anytime you use documentation, it's developer first and user first. So I think it's very Agile. It's not exactly always done. So who thinks documentation and Agile work together? Okay. By the way, you don't have to lie. You can be honest if you do. Who thinks Agile is Waterfall? Okay, that's actually pretty exciting. I mean, I'm sorry. Who thinks documentation is Waterfall? Who associates? That's pretty good. Okay. So that's what it's associated with. Old school, very top-down management. There's never enough time to do documentation. Who puts documentation as the last thing they do in their table? Or whose teams, maybe. Maybe it's whose teams. Don't be shy to raise your hands. Yeah, that's the truth of the matter. We're seeing quite a few hands popping up that, yeah, people are like, well, sometimes.
The best documentation is the code itself.
Okay, the best documentation is the code itself. That is an argument. Does that mean your code is completely self-explanatory?
Depending on who writes it.
Depending on who writes it, the code can be self-explanatory or not.
It's not an argument, because the truth is that not every consumer of your product will have access to the code.
Not every consumer of your product will have access to your code. Okay, so you need documentation, you're saying then?
I'm saying that if you're going to say that it has to be self-describing, that means the whole product has to be self-describing rather than just the code.
Which would be open source. So open source could be no?
Your users may not be tech savvy.
Okay.
They may not be developers.
This is a great point. So if your users aren't developers, can you have self-explanatory code? It doesn't matter then. But then are you then arguing in favor of documentation for users? And would your users read the documentation? To be devil's advocate against me.
Okay, so to pivot that around a bit, I would say that if you're going to say that it has to be self-explanatory, every aspect of it has to be self-explanatory. So as a user of a patient booking system, that has to be entirely self-explanatory. And for lack of documentation, I would need to be able to just start it up and immediately understand how to use it from the word go.
Okay, so you're saying perhaps like a receptionist at a health clinic would have to understand fully the healthcare documentation. You had said something? Sorry.
I can't remember what it was yet, but generally agreeing the code is not self-explanatory no matter what you do, because your user could be, if your user is a 40-year-old, which on an education product it is. The user, you're expecting a 4-year-old to read code documentation?
Actually, the 4-year-old might be better at reading code documentation for education than his parents. But yes, I think that's very valid, that we have to think of not just that we're developing for other developers, but for end users.
But yeah. To be honest, what's wrong with documentation? There's something wrong with 400 pages documentation. But if even you can use even your user stories as your documentation of the project. There's
Okay.
nothing wrong of the documenting something. It doesn't need to be like a huge document. It's like
That's a great point. That documentation can be good if it's user story based. It just doesn't need to be 400 pages. And
So I think the thing is, obviously, there's nothing that's ever been said that Agile is about having no documentation.
exactly.
yes,
Agile's always been about having the right amount of the right stuff. So
Very
having the
good.
right documentation.
you guys are skipping ahead in my slides. I love it. So no, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. We'll get to beers more quickly. So Agile is about good documentation, not about getting rid of documentation, documenting the right things.
I think if you don't document, then if you go back, 10 years on and say, I want to rebuild the system, but I have more requirements to put in, if you don't have no documentation, you just can't find the people who build it.
It's true. You have insane documentation debt
Yeah.
because the longer you have a product and you don't document it. So what do you do in that case then if you have an older product and now you'd say, oh crap, we have to document now? How do you deal with that?
Why would you? Why would you do that? If I've got an old system, what I'm going to document is what I need a new system to do. I need to document the failings of that old system.
Okay, document the failings.
I certainly don't want to read about an old system because I already know it's failing. I'm sure that's just a waste of my time.
Okay, but a lot of people still are using failed systems. That's the problem.
Yeah, but they say they're
The
failing.
government's included, but yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I just love the term hot potato because it is a hot potato system. It's the syndrome is that it's not mine. It's same as testing. It's not my job. So that's where the issue when it comes in. We have some great quotes. Basically, most people, this guy is arguing, Robert is arguing that nobody's actually agile. It's just a series of mini waterfalls. I will publish the quotes, so I'm just summarizing them now. We tend to just throw the whole thing over, even if you're doing design first and you have specs involved, then you throw it over to the time of documentation because the documentation people aren't usually at the table when the time comes to actually create those specs. Then Arnaud is talking about how this is the good and bad side of the Agile autonomy. He loves the autonomy of Agile. He works with a huge French bank, AXA Bank, and involving all of their internal and external APIs. And it's a lot, but he finds even more so the problem is with internal because they don't remember those other users that aren't at the table at that time. But he said, this is when it comes really bad when we're talking about microservices, containers. We have this wonderful autonomy for developers, but they're not taking ownership of the documentation process and no one's enforcing it. And then at least in the API space, but in anything that's serving other developers, it is the #1 thing most valuable. But in the API space, it's also what is most ignored. And so the ability to modify the whole thing that drives the whole process of almost every stage of the development. So actually documentation is considered like a flimsy, wimpier side of it because it's not as hardcore as coding, but it actually influences the entire development process. So it's kind of exciting and it's something maybe you can get your developers excited about updating the documentation or informing someone else to help update it. So why do we need documentation? I think we covered a lot of that already, so that was awesome. So thanks, we're getting ahead towards that beer. Other reasons is that it does affect decision making, especially in the API space, but overall. It cuts down on your customer support. Now, ironically, in the open source space, usually customer support is how they make money, but the open source space tends to be the best documented section. So it shows that you care about not just developer experience, but also customer experience. And it just helps you peg inefficiencies in the code and your processes. It leads to simpler code. It helps everything we talked about, containers and microservices and things like that. It helps bring things together because as we allow people to do more of their own thing, it's great in a way, but it's isolating in a way. And then you have spaghetti code, which wasn't supposed to happen with containers and Docker and things like that. It also kind of allows you to prototype. You can write spec ahead. If you have the person that's ahead of documentation, which we can discuss later who that person should be, at the table from the start, that helps everything along and helps be true. And then I think it's truly agile in a way. Documentation, I argue, is agile because it's all about collaboration. Successful documentation is. So what makes for good documentation? What do you like? You said, I heard simple before. Short.
Concise.
User story, concise.
Actionable.
Actionable. That was a very good word that I will add later to my slides.
Aimed at the appropriate audience.
I'm sorry?
Aimed at the appropriate audience.
Aimed at the appropriate audience. This is, as I said, I work mainly in the API space. Please tell me if it's different in your areas. But people forget to put the name of the topic of the API in the documentation all the time. Like, is it for banking? Is it for payments? What's it for? They never put that in, which is also, documentation is great SEO, is great search engine optimization. If you work in the tech space, people are Googling your product still. They're not using GitHub to find it. Probably the first place they're going is Google, and then that might lead them to GitHub. So you want about a little bit about your product, the statement of the goals of it, like maybe a paragraph, but that matters. And it's just a simple way of good documentation. It's simple to the point. It's searchable. It talks to the specific user, whoever he is talking to, I'm not sure. It's continuously integrated, or she, oh, no, he. It involves the consumer. Hey, I didn't make the pictures, take them. And if I can't describe it and I'm working around something else, I need to fix something in the code. So it's a big red flag that something's wrong in the code if a developer can't describe it themselves. They've written too complicated of a code. So they're a good place to start with the code. And that is from GitHub, Corian. And so now we're getting on to a couple user stories. So this is a company that went from Waterfall to Agile. It's kind of impressive when we're talking about a payments company that to even think back that they would have been Waterfall, but they were. And so they started with, they're a remote and mixed company, a very good company for that. They work from 4 countries all around, I think in 3 continents. And they were just, people were very frustrated, and internally they were extremely frustrated by everything. So their process was really interesting. They started their entire Agile process by surveying customers. Who's done that? Has anyone started, who's done an Agile transformation? Who's led or been a part of one? Okay, half the room, interesting. Who's actually started by talking to customers? Who started to talk to customers at any point in the Agile transformation? That's good. I like the idea that you start with customers. Maybe this is more lean, but I think they're very intrinsically linked, aren't they? And so then they worked with customer service to understand customer pain points. From there, they started to, they were very, I would say this was a lean Agile or Agile lean transformation. That's how she described it as well. They started trying to find the waste in their processes. Where were the bottlenecks? Then they gave 2 whole company, in-company workshops where everybody joined, and workshops, not speeches, anything like that, so interactive. So people understood the user personas they came up with by working with the users and working with customer service. And then they started on the customer journey mapping, which I'm going to go over a little bit in the next one. And then they compared with their customer, with their competition. So they were, so what's Braintree, what's Stripe doing? These are all really good things. This is marketing. Really, documentation is a form of marketing as well. And the process of making documentation means that you're making something good for your customers. So the lean customer journey mapping, which I named it, they asked, where do our customers need documentation? What kind of documentations do they want? What are their pain points? These are simple questions, but they get to a lot. And it's all about asking your customers this, asking your customer service, because they're on the front line, and then telling that narrative with your documentation. They basically said, we think that if a product is developed the right way, users shouldn't really need documentation. That's what we all say. That's what we said. If the code's self-explanatory, that's not true. When something goes wrong with the code, that's when they go to the documentation. Or if it's somebody that is a developer, is your audience, then they're using a daily. So what they focused on with their documentation was the integration, because that served the developers, and then the FAQ, because that's, people are Googling for answers to stuff, whether it's on your website or not. They're just, how do I do this? That's how we work. We're in the Google mindset. We don't think for ourselves anymore. The almighty Google of Oz thinks for us. So now we have SendGrid, which is, of course, we know an API-based company. A lot of people don't know how enormous SendGrid is. They send, it's supposed to be like 1 million messages per minute or things like that. They are the backbone behind a lot of communication in the world. And so they had Kanban, and they started out with Kanban going about 2 years ago. They had 2-week sprints. Documentation was never done. It just started accumulating over and over again. Who's in Scrum? Who has sprints? Okay. Who has documentation going, getting put to the side all the time? Even though I know you guys respect it and think it's important, but yeah, now hands are starting to go up. Yeah, we respect it. Don't offend me. It's okay. It's not going to offend me. Be honest. It's a safe space. They had huge technical debt, huge document debt. Their documentation that they did do kept being reactionary, so they kept saying, okay, we'll put that off till later, which might have been important, but because somebody said their needs were more important. Then they were constantly updating, changing their priorities, and they realized they needed to prioritize for the biggest impact. Earlier today, did anybody attend Dean's talk? It was very good, right? And he had a very simpler qualification of Little's Law, I believe it was called, which is how to decide what's the most important. This is a more complicated algorithm, but through an Excel spreadsheet. They got this from Intercom. They're not even customers of Intercom. You can look for this blog post. I definitely recommend it. So it's the RICE formula. Reach multiplied by impact, multiplied by confidence, divided by effort. So whatever comes up as the highest score, it becomes the one you actually choose and you do first. And it's very transparent. So everyone in the company is invested in this algorithm. Everyone knows where they're going to be on the to-do list. But on the other side, there's no question about it. And they were actually getting through small things that they thought would be unimportant because the algorithm brought it up as being more important because they could get it done quickly. So they understood about time effort. It solves for urgency. It solves for the size of the project. And it just gets things done, which, by the way, is grammatically incorrect. But we just accept it here. It gets things finished. We're not cake. And it's very transparent to everyone. But what they did then, they went a next step. So past the blog post that you can find online for Intercom, they added business imperative, what was deemed really important, and then they added due date in their algorithm. So just by that, tweaking it took them about 30 minutes total to implement this entire process, and then they tweak it every once in a while and review things when it doesn't work. So 30 minutes to get rid of a backlog is amazing. So 3 lines in Excel have superseded their entire Jira backlog. In the first month, the documentation team saw a 50% increased velocity. In the first week, the open source team saw double increase in speed. That's crazy. And especially if you have something open source code, documentation is what you have to do. There's no doubt. They never had to update the priorities. It just did it all for them, and they're extremely happy with it. And then there was a change to their culture as well. So it is about culture, even though documentation sounds like the least human thing possible. When something doesn't feel right, they start talking about it. They say something. So it opened discussion because everyone was a part of this, because everyone knew why. They realized that everything can be agile. They got rid of their efficiency. They met their efficiencies and frustrations and brought them to the conversation. And then again, backlog transparency, just not having to have people nag, when are you doing mine? If theirs is 30th on the backlog, now they know why at least, and it's not important. And the people in charge of the documentation can actually have an ability to say it more easily and not have to be forced and bullied into doing something that isn't truly a business objective. So, Scrum. Should documentation equal done on a Scrum team or any Agile team? Is your task not done or finished if it's not documented?
I don't think there's a yes or no answer to that.
Okay.
I think it depends on the task.
It depends on the task. Okay. Can you give an example?
Not without maybe being too specific in this forum, but I think in some cases, sure. I think API documentation, so your background, I think it's a very good example of something where documentation absolutely should be part of that process, and, and you would consider it to be part of the done definition.
Okay, in APIs, it has to be done. What else?
Right.
And when would it not be?
And I can imagine a raft of situations and deliveries where perhaps it's not absolutely necessary.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm saying as an abstract point is that in my mind, it depends.
It totally depends on the situation you're saying. Okay.
You can have a super small task to change a font color. You don't need to really document it.
Okay, font color, you don't need to document. Maybe you do need to document internally though. So you don't have to have that problem again.
Yeah, but then you have this task. It's a document itself of it.
Okay.
If you
Yeah,
have it organized really well, then you should have the whole history about it. It's not like you're just putting in the trash and forgetting about it.
okay.
we've
So
talked
you
about-
should save it. It should be eventually documented.
We talked about code specifically, and if I'm going to do some refactoring on a particular set of classes or a particular module, I don't feel I necessarily, by necessity, need to document that and what I've done, because that's an example of where the code does document that, and I've got it in a source control mechanism, and that source control mechanism can show the history. So
Okay. So source control and version controlling is an important
in a
part
way,
of
that
automation.
becomes the self-generating
And it-
documentation of what I've done.
Okay.
Well, you can add to that, if the thing actually, the task actually has requirement and test case around it, the task itself may not require the documentation because it's wrapped in documentation that are two separate tasks, or one task if you do BDD.
So you're saying testing then becomes, by documenting your testing, you're documenting the change?
Well, so you're documenting up front in the form of a requirement that includes test
Fair.
cases. That's it. That is one task. The second task is do with document what your requirements said. Once that's done, because the test cases were up front, the documentation that piece of code either meets or does not meet the test cases that were already provided.
Okay.
So they're two separate tasks that can be done separately. Whether the project itself is done, that's another story. So
That's a valid point. Okay, so testing is a vital point, a part of documenting as
Yeah.
well, and writing the requirements. That's fantastic. That doesn't mean developers always write the requirements for the testing, right? Because sometimes, again, hot potato. Testing often becomes the hot potato where they don't want to
no,
pass it, but
well, in two levels. So one level, the test cases should be done up front with the requirement. They might need more detail that could be done either in participation with either a tester or tester in participation with the developer who's going to do the piece. Just so long as it's there and you've got piece of code has been tested against what its expected outcome is, and someone can say yes it does it or no it doesn't do it.
that's fantastic. Yeah, the requirements and how it's tested is a way to document it. And what you actually spoke about that wasn't actually in my slides or anything, but is interesting is you're talking about that can only really happen if the tester and the developer are working together as well and communicating, which is what this all comes down to. It's about communication, and that's what Agile is. So that was fantastic. Thank you. So if you're going to do it, you have to start early. You have to sit side by side. You have to have people together. There can't be silos. There can't be different rooms or sections. Or if you're in a remote team, you've got to be communicating somewhere in a remote water cooler or something of the sort. You need to continually update it. And this is something, if you're going Agile, it has to be continually updated. If you're going to identify it as that, you can't be shipped if it's not documented. That's the definition of done. But also, you have to have tested in there probably before documented then. But documented might drive the testing. So whatever order those are really essentially linked together. And then if you do it, it does help you check in with both user experience and developer experience. But it's not for everybody. And I will leave that quote for later. So Rob has created a questionnaire basically to help you do this. So just raise your hand just to maybe you guys know if it would suit you as having done on your own team or not. Can anyone other than the technical writer complete the documentation tasks on your team?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. this one has an answer at the end, or he has a specific answer for this, but what portion of the documentation can be finished quickly by your tech writer? What do you guys think?
Who has a tech writer?
Who has a tech writer? Interesting point, yeah. You have a tech writer?
We do.
And how much of the documentation do they do, or can they do?
So it's an interesting question because...
Well, what type of company are you, first of all? What type of software?
Financial services.
Mm-hmm. Financial services software with a tech writer, okay.
Yes. So he's actually more of a tech editor in practice.
A tech editor, okay.
Yes. So what tends to happen is that it will be laid out by developers, by SMEs, by VAs, by people of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And then he will then, should we say, prettify, edit, marketify, whatever words we want to choose.
Love it.
That documentation such that it has a consistent voice and it's aimed at the right audience and things of that nature.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
How much does he do of it? What percentage?
It's difficult to put a number on that, really.
Give a guess.
Let's say, if we mean in terms of output, let's say 20%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. 20%. That's good. So basically what he's saying, if you're a single functional team, if you're leaving it just to the tech, you probably can't have a definition of done unless you're having a single functional team where the tech writer does 75% or more, or semi-functional team 50% or more. So Rob would say you can't have documentation as the definition of done. I don't know. I would say if you get everyone involved in taking care of their own shit, maybe you can. So it's about ownership and responsibility. So this is when these questions are basically decide if you can or not completely. Is the documentation at your company consistently high quality? Very good. Yeah, it's because we said financial services, so yeah, that is good. But only one in the room. That's concerning me.
I would be careful about assuming that that's true of financial services as a whole.
Valid. It's just you have more money towards the documentation curator, right? Or no?
I don't necessarily think it's an issue of money. I think it's an issue of intent and the quality that you want to associate with your product.
Okay.
I would say financial services have been very bad at and they've been a key one through my experience of cutting documentation.
Yeah.
Quite right.
Because it's not making them money as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. Which is crazy because documentation leads to customer retention.
I suppose, but a lot of it has been internal.
Yeah.
So
even more so internal retention.
So they dump the documentation, let's take the code, let's make it work, and let's go with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you make a very good point, and as financial services moves towards a more external model, I think documentation is more and more going to be considered a priority, whereas perhaps it hasn't been in the past because it's been internal.
PSD2, if it's driven by APIs with PSD2, that's going to be the next step with financial services. Is they don't say it. They don't actually use the word API that much. They kind of skirt around it, but with PSD2, it's very clear. It's APIs is the only way that's going to happen with Open Banking Initiative. This is what we're talking about, is the new initiative actually driven by UK, but across Europe, by UK banks across Europe, about making banking more open and accessible to everyone, and APIs, the application programming interface, is going to be the part that drives it. But they don't really use that word a lot in the text. They're kind of skirting around that still, and then until they start using it, the natural logic is that documentation will become more important in financial services, absolutely. Sadly, only one person in the room admitted that their documentation is high quality. Either we're sad or we're tired.
Is that high or consistent?
I mean, it depends how we define the word high.
What happened? Oh, here we go.
It's high versus my experience.
Okay. Yeah, it is a relative term, high quality. Come on. Oh, I went too far. Okay. Is there only one deliverable in your company? Like, at one time? No, not really. So that makes it harder as well to make documentation as the definition of done. Do you have this is my favorite because I do this all the time in content curation and blogging. Do you have any type of style guide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. That is great. This is where you save a lot of time in your company. You give templates, you give standards. If you have a blog on your website, I'd consider, or website design, I'd say do the same thing. I think these are ways you save time and get people very autonomous in doing the right thing. And let everyone just throw it in Google Doc. That's what we do, and anyone has access to edit it. The same thing, just do that so everyone can access, or any type of If you're on Microsoft, some other shared documents or things like that. And does your team enhance your documentation? Does anyone look it over and make it better? Yeah, that's the thing. If you let everyone involved in documentation, it can be better. Probably you're not ready yet to have documentation as your definition of done. But that's okay. This is the fact, though. Documentation should not be part of the software development process that causes you to not get done. So it's something, just like any agile change, you need to plan it ahead, you need to communicate it ahead, you need to work together to put that change in process, because you don't want it to be the impetus that keeps you from getting things done. So how can docs jive with Agile? This is, you use many different terms: marketing, prettyify, different things that your documentation writer does that brings everything together. I call it curator, but it's a different thing because I look at documentation as an art. So it's a different way to go, and I threw in the style guide again there because I think it's that important and it will come up again. Okay, how do you automate documentation processes? Does anyone have any automation happening with their documentation processes?
My previous job, yes.
Okay, what did you have?
I had no idea.
Ah.
The tech writer did it.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, she worked really closely with the software dev team, and every sprint they release a release note to the commercial people, and so the commercial people can go and talk to their integrated partners on how to whether or not they need to upgrade the software or not based on the customer need. And that's all by reading the code and actually automating the release notes.
Oh, that's fantastic. So they automated the release notes so the customers, the external customers, could know when things were updated. Fantastic. That's great. How do you automate? You create a duplicatable process, and then it's basically so you don't miss anything. We're humans. We're not very good at that. We're not very good at repeatable tasks. Machines are. So as much as possible, you can. Chris gave another talk at an API Docs conference, and he offered he works for Contentful, and he offered some tools that you should use and other ideas. Markdown Spellcheck is a really good one. It's a free tool because it's Markdown, of course. And we don't think about it, but spelling really matters in code. How you spell things could really change things. Even gray in my country is different from gray in this country, spelled differently, and it could break the code. So creating a style guide and pouring that information into a Markdown spell check, which you can edit and customize for yourself, is a fantastic idea. Because it's a little thing that fixes a lot of stuff in the code, but then vice versa, so then that automates it for you, and then that can then become your quick reference guide or documentation style guide that helps people then write code better, and then it goes back in the documentation. It filters back and forth. Any type of code example testing, as long as you're passing that, that kind of pretty much creates your documentation for you, right? And then there's a lot of screenshot automation tools of successful tests that you can add in there, which actually helps a lot because then you can turn that into videos that turn into explanations and documentation. I've been talking about very stagnant documentation too, but don't forget, a documentation can easily be a video walkthrough and demo. And that tends to be, for someone like me, a great way to do it. One of the things that we quickly realized was that what we couldn't do was create documentation that lived apart from the code. It had to live directly alongside our code, or it'd be immediately out of date. So that's the fact. Rich is an Agile coach, like many of you, and he realized that's the only way in the Agile community they could achieve documentation, was that it lived alongside the code. So as much as you can automate as possible is great. Documentation takes discipline. Like I said, robots are better at it than us. So as much as possible you can, and then everyone has to be a part of it in order to be fun. And you got to get people enthusiastic, and that's your jobs as coaches, is to get people enthusiastic about these changes. The pieces of the changing development cycle need documentation. It's actually making it more necessary, but people aren't being as much individually responsible. They're just responsible for their own code. But it's a great way to make people feel, again, responsible for the collective products, not for their just piece of code. It's a great way to bring people together, I believe documentation is. And it's great because everyone is in charge of their own piece. Everyone becomes invested in simple, more self-explanatory code that they can then explain. So maybe self-explanatory is not the right word. Explainable code that they could easily describe, right? And then they're still allowed to be creative, but they're forced to then communicate it. So does anyone have any actionable steps that they want to take from this? Oh, that's sad. That's okay. We can think about it. No.
Yeah, time to think.
Simmer around. So it's beer o'clock. Thank you guys all very much. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. Okay, thank you.